Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to the sixth event in our 2022-2023 Virtual Scholarly Seminar Series titled Surviving the Long Wars. My name is Rona K. Kapadia. I'm an Associate Professor of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and one of the co-organizers of this series, along with my Museum and Exhibition Studies colleagues, Therese Quinn and Aaron Hughes. By way of a visual description, I'm a 40-year-old brown person in a white dress shirt with pinstripes, gray pinstripes in my home office on the northwest side of our city. We'll be getting started in just a few moments, but first, an access invitation. We invite you to get comfortable in your space. Live captioning is available for this webinar. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can see and click CC Live Transcript and then show subtitles. You can also access the captions in a separate stream text web browser window. We're dropping that link in the chat now, and we'll redrop it periodically throughout the session. After my opening remarks, the chat will be turned off for all attendees during the webinar as an access consideration for those of us using screen readers. But we invite you to post comments and questions throughout today's conversation in the Q&A feature, which we will address as time permits. Although our focus today is on a moderated discussion with our esteemed speaker, Kelly Hayes, led by my co-organizer, Aaron Hughes. If there are any other access needs, please post them in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to meet them in real time. Please note that we are recording today's webinar, and a digital archive of all of our seminar events can be found on our website, survivingthelongwars.online, which is also where you can join our mailing list to learn about future events in the series, as well as our culminating exhibitions held in the 2023 Veteran Art Triennial at the Chicago Cultural Center, the Hyde Park Art Center, and the Newberry Library, which are on display now. We're going to drop more information about the exhibitions in the chat now, and that is my cue to inform you to stay tuned for the final talk in our scholarly seminar series in the spring 2023 semester by Professor Tiffany King on Thursday, April 13th, just 2 weeks away. We'll drop the Eventbrite information for the King event in the chat now as well. That's my cue to inform you to visit our exhibitions held at the Chicago Cultural Center, the Hyde Park Art Center, and the Newberry Library. But to start off today's event, while we are in virtual space together, we want to acknowledge and honor the original peoples of the Chicagoland area where the University of Illinois Chicago is based, the Three Fires Confederacy, the Potawatomi, the Odawa, and Ojibwe nations, as well as other tribal nations that know this area as their ancestral homelands, including the Menominee, the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Peoria, and Sac and Fox, as well as their descendants. Further, we acknowledge this land as the current home to one of the largest urban Native American communities in the United States. Native people are part of Chicago's past, present, and future. And finally, we are reminded that a land acknowledgement, especially by non-Native diasporic settler people of color like myself, should not just be a rhetorical gesture, but instead the animating force and material ground from which any critique of violence, imperialism, militarism, and warfare that we forward here today is made possible. To acknowledge is to act, and we encourage everyone to consider the multitude of ways to translate knowledge and thoughts into active support for Indigenous peoples and communities locally, nationally, and around the world. To provide immediate assistance to Native American communities in Chicago, you can send donations to the city's American Indian Center at the link we're dropping in the chat now. By way of introduction, we are a collective of scholars, curators, and artists at UIC working at the nexus of critical ethnic studies, feminist and queer studies, contemporary art, and museum and exhibition studies. We've been collaborating for nearly 2 years on a National Endowment for the Humanities funded project. Surviving the Long Wars explores the multiple overlapping histories that shape our understanding of warfare, as well as the alternative visions of peace, healing, and justice generated by diverse communities impacted by war. Our project attempts to visualize the parallels and intimacies between the two longest military conflicts in US history, the American Indian Wars of the 18th and 19th centuries, and the 21st century global war on terror from the vantage point of contemporary Black, Indigenous, and people of color veteran artists, as well as those most impacted by these wars. Today's talk by Kelly Hayes is the 6th in a virtual scholarly seminar series on new directions in comparative ethnic and Native and Indigenous studies, on the histories and futures of Native rebellion, alongside contemporary US militarism and war. As I mentioned, we have just one more exciting talk scheduled in our series with Tiffany King on the 13th of April. And you can find details on our website, which we're dropping in the chat now. The seminar series is part of a year-long UIC graduate class and NEH Dialogues on the Experiences of War discussion program taught by my collaborator on this project and co-organizer, veteran artist Aaron Hughes, which explores the legacies of US settler colonial military conflicts through the artistic practices and experiences of BIPOC veterans and those communities most impacted by these war regimes, including Native and Indigenous descendants and South and Southwest Asian and Muslim diaspora communities. Our entire project has culminated with the second Veteran Art Triennial and Summit earlier this month. We've curated over 45 BIPOC artists across these 3 concurrent exhibitions, and we're very excited to be sharing all of this work with you in Chicago through this spring. Throughout this project, we've hoped to spotlight new scholarship, forge innovative community collaborations, diminish silos in our interdisciplinary fields, and most importantly, highlight the role of art and culture in the historic and ongoing movement against militarization, war, and empire. So now some thank yous. Surviving the Long Wars is organized by Aaron Hughes, myself, Therese Quinn, Joseph Left Hand, Miranda Roberts, Anthony Torres, and Amber Zora, with support from the University of Illinois Chicago Institute for the Humanities Innovation Grants, the UIC Award for Creative Activity, the Chicago Cultural Center, the Hyde Park Art Center, the Newberry Library, the D-Mill Art Fund, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Special thanks to Margaret Fink of the UIC Disability Cultural Center, and Zainab Hilal and Rachel Dukes, our amazing graduate coordinators at UIC on this project, as well as our captioner today, Tina Dillon. It's now my pleasure to briefly introduce our moderator and co-organizer, Aaron Hughes, who will be introducing our esteemed speaker, Kelly Hayes, today. We'll also drop these bios into the chat feature as well. Aaron Hughes is an artist, curator, organizer, teacher, anti-war activist, and Iraq War veteran. Working through an interdisciplinary practice rooted in drawing and printmaking, Hughes works collaboratively to create meaning out of personal and collective trauma, transform systems of oppression, and seek liberation. He develops projects that often utilize popular research strategies, experiments with forms of direct democracy, and operates in solidarity with people most impacted by structural violence. Hughes works with a range of art and activist groups, including Just Seeds Artists Cooperative, About Face Veterans Against the War, the Emerging Veteran Art Movement, and Prison and Neighborhood Arts Education Project. Hughes, of course, is also my esteemed comrade and co-director on the Surviving the Long Wars project. Aaron, it's my pleasure to welcome you. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Ronak, for that wonderful introduction. By way of a visual description, I'm a 41-year-old white male with a red beard. I'm wearing an Iraq Veterans Against the War hoodie. I'm in my apartment with a blurred background. I'm honored to be here today as both an artist and organizer, co-director of Surviving the Long Wars, to introduce our 6th scholarly seminar with Kelly Hayes. Her talk today, Not Our First Apocalypse, Indigenous Struggle on the Edge of Everything, will be informative to understanding the connections and contradictions between the Indian Wars, the quote-unquote Indian Wars, and the global war on terror. Specifically, Kelly has written extensively about the legacy of state violence and the importance of resistance movements and abolition. I specifically have appreciated Kelly's focus on creative direct actions and confronting power structures intimately connected with the legacies and logics of the global war on terror and the quote-unquote American Indian Wars. I believe Kelly and I first connected to work with the Resist, Reimagine, Rebuild coalition that was happening here in Chicago. From that first experience of getting to hear Kelly speak in one of those organizing meetings, I knew they were an important leader, educator, and mentor in the movement. Last year, I was honored to work on a Just Seeds CSA print with the amazing Chicago activist artist, Monica Trinidad. Shout out to Monica. The print was based on a quote from Kelly's Movement Memos podcast. In January of 2022, Kelly spoke with the artist, filmmaker, organizer, Bree Newsom Bass on the long COVID on long COVID, voting rights, and organizing in these tumultuous times, and speaking on what it can be look like for people to broaden what it means to be politically engaged in these times. Kelly said the following: as activists and organizers, we are building in an era of collapse. Our work is set against all probability, and it is in that space of cherished improbability where our art will be made, our joy will be found, and where our ingenuity will fashion ways of living and caring for each other, even as the ground shifts beneath our feet. Life will be a scramble, but we will not scramble alone. With that, I'm honored to introduce Kelly Hayes. Kelly Hayes is a Minimami author, organizer, photographer, and direct action trainer. Kelly co-founded the Lifted Voices Collective and the Chicago Light Brigade. Her written work can be found in Truth Out, Teen Vogue, Bustle, numerous anthologies, as well as the upcoming book, Let This Radicalize You, co-authored with Mariam Kaba. Kelly has trained thousands of people across the country in direct action tactics and movement strategy. She is also host of the Truth Out podcast Movement Memos. To listen to episodes or read the transcripts, visit Truth Out. We'll post a link in the side. And here, her talk today is titled Not Our First Apocalypse, Indigenous Struggle on the Edge of Everything. Welcome, Kelly Hayes.
Hi, everyone. I am Kelly Hayes. Visually, I am a light-skinned Native person with long, dark hair, and I am currently wearing big black-rimmed glasses with rhinestones and a blue shirt. My background is blurred. I want to thank Aaron for that wonderful introduction. By the way, y'all are going to hear that quote again later because it's also in the book, and I'll be quoting me and Miriam's book a little bit today. I want to thank Aaron for that introduction, of course, and I also want to thank the organizers and everyone in attendance for sharing space with me and welcoming me into this conversation. I want to begin today by sharing a passage from my upcoming book with Mariam Kaba, Let This Radicalize You. In a chapter called Care is Fundamental, we wrote, care-driven organizing confounds the logics that are deployed to perpetuate wars, whether against a nation state, against terrorism, or against crime. All movements that offer aid and comfort to criminalized and illegalized people are anti-war movements because they exist in opposition to the war-making of targeted criminalization, scapegoating, and escalations and militarism that accompany those efforts. Like anti-war movements that oppose wars waged in and against foreign nations, movements that counter wars of criminalization highlight the number of casualties, the systemic abuses, and the dishonest framing of the system's warfare. They are movements against dehumanization. I have long said that wars are being waged against us, regardless of whether we are organizing in our own defense or going down without a fight. The wars have been continuous. I personally believe that the apocalypse we are presently experiencing began with the onset of capitalism, the looting of continents, the annihilation of tens of millions of indigenous people in North America, the systemic enslavement of African people, and the Industrial Revolution's cycles of extraction, contamination, exploitation, and depletion. All of those things delivered us to this moment. Worlds have always been ending under capitalism, and long wars have always been waged. In the US, some of capitalism's worst impacts have been outsourced to poorer countries or to marginalized communities who capitalists attempt to invisibilize in the media. In spite of this invisibilization, many people understand that their lifestyles ultimately come at the expense of others who may die young with broken bodies and poisoned lungs, whose water may be poisoned, whose children may be stillborn. But many people are accustomed to viewing those injustices as happening over there, somewhere. Dystopian, world-ending violence can be siloed in the popular imagination. Many people are aware that other human beings are suffering horribly, and that the earth itself is being murdered. And yet they go about their lives as though the compartmentalization of capitalism will somehow protect those whose homes are not yet burning underwater or under siege. Of course, we know this is not the case. Compartmentalization only works for so long. Once a fire or a flood has breached a critical number of compartments, the building will burn and the ship will sink. Capitalism's compartmentalization is in the process of failing. And what we have been told is likely the homestretch of the Capitalocene, a term coined by Jason Moore to characterize the era in which human activity has been the dominant influence on climate and the environment, with mass destruction emerging from capitalist relations. Some people are being confronted with the idea of an apocalypse in real terms for the first time. I was once corrected by an editor when I said that most people lacked the ability to imagine our extinction, and that this was part of our problem. That editor insisted that endless examples of apocalyptic fiction demonstrated that people could totally imagine human extinction. But do those stories actually help us imagine anything like our own end? For the most part, I would argue they do not. As Chris Begley has written, many apocalyptic stories are fantasies of wish fulfillment that represent a masculinist longing for simpler times and fully justified violence. They also usually involve some profound event that knocks humanity off our feet, as though if it weren't for that meteor or that comet or those zombies, we might have been fine. Such stories do not interrogate the slow manner in which the ruling class, corporations, and militaries have actually waged war on the poor, on workers, or on the planet. As Chris wrote in The Next Apocalypse, compared to the typical apocalyptic narrative, the COVID-19 pandemic must have been the most unsatisfying apocalypse imaginable. What he meant by that was that in its early months, the pandemic was an apocalyptic moment that didn't match up with our fantasies. It was a long, slow ordeal, and what was being asked of us in terms of masking, staying home, and maybe doing some mutual aid wasn't the least bit exciting. Most people could not imagine a battle for human survival occurring on such boring, everyday terms. And that's a recurring problem for us all. All the same, for many Americans, the COVID-19 pandemic was their first taste of collapse. It's not as though we were safe before. A great many people in the US are living on the edge on a good day in any number of ways, but we also cherish our illusions. After all, a person's sense of safety has a lot more to do with what's familiar than what actually insulates or protects them. So to most people, safety is simply a question of whether they can continue to replicate the social relations that they are accustomed to. If we can't do that, we tend to panic and struggle follows as our worlds get reordered. I believe that sense of unfamiliar abandonment and the indignance it inspired is a big reason we saw so many white people take to the streets in May of 2020 as Black people rebelled against police killings. I believe it's also the same reason that we saw many activists and organizations embrace disability justice for a fleeting moment in 2020. For a time, people who had previously felt safe saw a clear overlap between the conditions they were experiencing and the conditions that people more marginalized themselves faced. Once those people felt that a social divide had been reinstated by the election of Biden or by COVID becoming less lethal, much of that solidarity sadly dissipated. That too is a sort of recurring problem for us all. So if people are capable of making these connections and acting upon them, why are they so committed to reenacting normalcy while the world burns? We have been hearing projections for years about just how close we are to ecological collapse, but in my experience, most people do not internalize that information. They keep it at arm's length, distancing themselves from what it means or demands of them, because they either cannot bear it or cannot reconcile it with their experience or the lies they tell themselves to get through the day. I saw that same tendency at work in friends of mine who kept breaking COVID safety protocols early in the pandemic. These weren't fascists or people who burned masks or insulted healthcare workers. They were people who shared my values, but could not put those values into practice because their minds could not hold or process the truth of what was happening. Proceeding as normal is our default human response to most things. We try to replicate the things we know because they are familiar, and that makes our world feel intact. The norms of capitalism are familiar, despite their brutality, and we are watching in real time as the wealthy discover just how many human beings we are willing to dispose of in order to maintain those norms, and how close to home those losses will hit before we do a damn thing about it. Make no mistake, the normalization of COVID deaths in the wake of a failed governmental response to the pandemic is a blueprint for the future. 1 million people were ground under in the US as corporations enjoyed record profits. And while these conditions have helped to energize organized labor, they have also emboldened all the worst people. Corporations and politicians alike realized that to maintain capitalism in an era of collapse, they're going to have to keep cutting their losses. The ruling class will increasingly systematize and normalize the mass disposal of human beings on the basis of scarcity or perceived scarcity. We are already seeing that process optimized by AI programs as asylum seekers are denied interviews, disqualified or derailed by CBP-1 app. We are seeing it with systems like NextCare, which are supposed to reduce the opioid crisis by determining who is eligible for narcotic painkillers, or with CIRI, an algorithm that was deployed in the Netherlands to generate lists of people suspected of housing or benefits fraud. In all of these cases, we have seen vulnerable people mistreated, mischaracterized, and made to suffer on the basis of algorithmic determinations. As horrifying as the weapons to come are that are entrenched in this technology, this everyday bureaucratic violence is going to accumulate much more quickly. Technology is entrenching bureaucratic violence in ways that remove the potential for compassion, mercy, or reason. As Dan McQuillan writes in Resisting AI, an anti-fascist approach to artificial intelligence, the net effect of applied AI is to amplify existing inequalities and injustices, deepening existing divisions on the way to full-on algorithmic authoritarianism. The ascent of AI technology as a means of entrenching and ensuring capitalist violence may be less compelling than the rise of Skynet in the Terminator films, but our current apocalypse was not built to entertain. It was built by forces that are intent on extracting resources, labor, and time by any means necessary until nothing remains. It's also worth mentioning while we're talking about AI that these technologies are also highly compatible with the global ascent of fascism. As McQuillan reminds us, in court, Adolf Eichmann was unable to express or explain himself in ways that broke out of bureaucratic jargon, saying, "Officialese is my only language." Like many in the SS, he prided himself on his objective attitude. So, how can we survive these long wars? I think part of the answer to that question lies in what survival means to us and what our lives mean to us in collectivity. Individualism has hindered and siloed us. As people like Elon Musk overtake social networks, spewing fascist propaganda on an unthinkable scale, deepfakes, misinformation, and in-group, out-group dynamics further splinter our shared realities, which makes us less able to agree, cohere, and fight in the name of our shared interests. Many people have simply forgotten how to relate to one another, or even tolerate one another. And when it comes to parsing difficult topics or agreeing on strategic directions, we are in even bigger trouble, as any of you who are organizers can likely attest. Many people doing social justice work are horribly overwhelmed. So where to begin? I know that for myself, when I want to do something I don't know how to do, I often check to see if anyone's done it before and how that worked for them. While these times we are living in are in many ways unprecedented, this is not our first apocalypse. As Leanne Simpson wrote in her book with Robin Maynard, Rehearsals for Living, imperialism and ongoing colonialism have been ending worlds for as long as they have been in existence. And Indigenous and Black peoples have been building worlds and then rebuilding worlds for as long as we have been in existence. Relentlessly building worlds through unspeakable violence and loss, building worlds and living in them anyway. The people of the Menominee Nation, my people, undertook that challenge when my ancestors were being cut down by contagions and violence of white settlers. A quarter of the Menominee population was lost to smallpox in 1834 alone. My ancestors endured unspeakable violence, the mass theft of land, brutal winters, food scarcity, the illegalization of traditional lifeways and spiritual practices. And at one point, the federal government actually terminated our nation's tribal status, declaring that we as a people no longer existed. But we have endured. As David R.M. Beck wrote in his book, Siege and Survival, Menominee tribal survival into the reservation period was based on two principal factors: perceptive, stalwart, far-seeing leadership, and maintenance of core values. Those values included the expectation that leadership consult the larger community when making group decisions, and the importance of providing for everyone. As Beck wrote, the Menominee rewarded generosity and sharing of resources and decried as non-Menominee the failure to do so. Ruth Wilson Gilmore tells us that where life is precious, life is precious. And I have learned from her and from my people that to survive the unthinkable, we must be precious to each other. Placing an inherent value on the lives of other Menominee people, even if they were assholes, allowed my people to maintain their struggle in collectivity. And I can still see those values at work today. Some years back, for example, there was a terrible storm on the reservation and a lot of people lost power. Immediately, community members mobilized to bring generators to a local school to power up the building's large freezer and refrigeration system. Word quickly spread that anyone who had lost power could bring their food to the school in order to prevent their food stocks from spoiling. Many people on my reservation purchase items like meat in bulk when they can afford to. Losing a fridge and freezer full of groceries can be a devastating setback for an impoverished person or for a struggling family. So the community found a way. There's also a group on my reservation called the Woodland Women. This group is very dear to me, and I have collaborated with them on a number of occasions around mutual aid efforts. They began as a support group for trauma survivors, but evolved over time into a great deal more, as the women began crafting together and elders provided cultural education, and members discussed community problems and how they might take action together. Despite its growing functionality, the group remained a lifeline for members grappling with trauma, loss, and substance disorders. So when the pandemic hit and the women were forced to shelter in place, a group call was held where elders reinforced to other members that they needed to abide by safety protocols and that this period of sheltering in place should be viewed as a fast. Instead of sacrificing food by going unsatiated, as one might during a traditional fast, they told members they were sacrificing time in their lives that they would otherwise spend as they chose in order to protect one another. Time was a great sacrifice because it is so limited, but it was also an opportunity, the elders said, to think about how we appreciate time and what we do with it. The group's members reflected on what they meant to each other and what time meant to them, and they devised a mutual aid effort that would allow them to support elders who could not go safely to the grocery store and others who were in crisis. Their weekly crafting was disrupted by the fact that not all of them had sewing machines at home, so my collective, Lifted Voices, fundraised to ensure that every member of the Woodland Women who wanted a sewing machine could have one, which allowed the women to sew together via Zoom. Their annual tradition of making free regalia for children who had none continued, even though all of the powwows were postponed. They also made and distributed masks. I have learned a lot from those women and their ways of living and being together. I have also learned a lot from my young friend, Jenny Martinez, who you can read about in Let This Radicalize You. Jenny is a young Indigenous person who I've had the honor of mentoring since she was 16. She is now in her mid-20s and works as a social worker. Jenny lives in Seattle, which, as many of you know, was hit hard by the pandemic. When vaccines came along, Jenny was really excited and thought the nonprofit that she worked for could be a resource, offering multilingual education materials to the immigrant community the organization served, and perhaps even hosting a vaccine clinic. But she quickly found that the people the organization served were largely hesitant about the vaccine, as were a number of the staff members. There was no enthusiasm among other employees or management around the idea of uplifting the vaccine as an option for clients. Jenny was deeply upset by that, because for one thing, most public health information about the vaccine in Seattle was only being circulated in English. Appointments were likewise difficult to book for non-English speakers. So Jenny felt the immigrant community was not being given the opportunity to decide for themselves if the vaccine was worth it. So she brought her skills as an organizer to the table and had a lot of repetitive, curious conversations with people who were willing to have them. She opened up at a women's group about her own experience getting vaccinated and what the process was like for her parents. She didn't make any asks at that time or tell anyone what they ought to do, but she started a conversation. She followed up on that conversation by calling some of the mothers in attendance and asking them what they thought about what she shared. As the mothers shared their fears and concerns, Jenny embarked on a learning journey with those individuals, suggesting that they find the answers to these concerns together. Her conversations were ongoing, and she was often met with misinformation that people had picked up somewhere. But rather than lecturing and correcting, Jenny took a Freirean approach, thinking and learning alongside community members, helping them to navigate their concerns. Jenny explained to me that she wanted to give people a place to come with their fears, because otherwise they were going to go online, where they were going to be met with misinformation or scolded for their perceived selfishness because they were hesitant about the vaccine. These conversations, in many cases, went on for months, and people would often ask Jenny to restate things she had previously explained, which she always would. By the time she was able to convince her bosses to organize a vaccine clinic in April of 2020, demand among clients was high. In fact, the vaccine clinic was delayed because the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was briefly pulled from the market. And there was an uproar among clients who had now read up on that vaccine and felt the risk was minimal. Fortunately, a new vaccine clinic was quickly organized with the Pfizer vaccine, and nearly all of the families involved with the organization were vaccinated. This would not have happened without Jenny, and I want to emphasize that it would not have happened if Jenny had taken an adversarial stance. And this is something that applies across the course of all of our movements, no matter what kind of care we are organizing for or what kind of violence we are organizing against. People who were vaccine hesitant in general were met with an adversarial stance. As someone who understands a bit about persuasion, it was horrifying watching people blow it by scolding and mocking people for being afraid of the vaccine. Sure, some of those people were fascist assholes for whom refusing the vaccine was a political act. But most of the people I knew who were vaccine hesitant were Black, Native, and people of color. And in situations where I managed to convince people to let me make them a vaccine appointment or to take them to get the vaccine, it wasn't a matter of saying, here's my thinking and it's better than yours. It was a matter of thinking alongside and of caring. As some of you may have noticed, most of us are more likely to listen to people who we believe care about us and who listen to our ideas and concerns. A lot of US politics has been stripped down to self-expression and moral strutting, proving you're on the right side and condemning anyone who isn't. Those politics aren't just self-destructive, they are self-immolating, because we need each other. And no community has ever survived the unthinkable by dividing themselves into subcategories of worth. To survive, we must be precious to each other, and we must act accordingly. That kind of political practice will require a hard reset for a lot of people, which is one of the reasons Miriam and I wrote Let This Radicalize You, which is geared towards young people or people who are young in their organizing. Miriam and I each wrote introductions for the book. And while considering the work before us and the work of young people like Jenny, I would like to share the following words from my introduction, which will be somewhat familiar. We talk a lot about possibility and hope in this book, and we are by no means attempting to minimize the stakes or the obstacles you will face in your work. I know these are frightening and even soul-shaking times. I cannot tell you that the tumult will relent, because it will not. But I can tell you, here, on the edge of everything, we are each other's best hope. As organizers, we are builders in an era of collapse. Our work is set against all probability, and it is in that space of cherished improbability where our art will be made, where our joy will be found, and where our ingenuity will fashion ways of living and caring for each other, even as the ground shifts beneath our feet. Life will be a scramble, but we will not scramble alone. Together, we will fight for this world, to keep it. Lastly, I want to state that while I believe there is a great deal of Indigenous wisdom and Indigenous practice that can help us survive the long wars ahead, I do not believe that any community has an inherent analysis, or that any group should shoulder the burden of being viewed as the solution or having all the answers. None of us does. In fact, I know that a great many of my people have been battered into a state of lowered expectations. Suffering does not always yield demands for transformation. As John Jost writes, marginalization often positions people to further justify the systems that harm them. The impulse is self-injurious, but it is also palliative. It's easier to believe that the system should be maintained and that it's our best hope. It's harder to imagine something else, and maybe hardest of all, to envision our true potential. Even harder, perhaps, than imagining our own extinction. But such dreams are possible, and the life ways and practices we are talking about are not far-fetched or unthinkable. Even Jost, who is a fairly pessimistic political psychologist, acknowledges that belief and identification with a group, such as a labor union, can supersede the impulse to justify a system. Group justification can overwhelm system justification. But to experience that kind of group identity, we have to build together. We have to fight together. We have to listen to each other, even when it's hard. We have to learn and think alongside one another. And we must be precious to each other. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. Thank you so much, Kelly. That was so extremely powerful, and gave me a lot to think about. And I was feverishly taking notes the whole time. And it puts into question a lot of the things I was hoping to ask. But I just wanted to just reflect a few things that you said. You know, I was teaching at Stateville when the vaccine first started coming out. And first, like, it was hard to get access to the vaccine for the guys inside. And then when people were able to get the vaccine, a number of our students were really hesitant. And yeah, I remember the really hard conversations and slow conversations, and yeah, how to meet people where they're at and create space. And, you know, that kind of, I guess, is really where I wanted to start this time, because in an article you wrote in 2018, you talked about how, as a society, this is a quote from you, we have long turned away from any social concerns that overwhelm us. Whether it's war, climate change, or prison industrial complex, Americans have been conditioned to simply look away from profound harms. Years of this practice have now left us with endless war, dying oceans, millions of people in bondage and oppressively policed. It is time for a thorough, unflinching examination of what our society has wrought and what we have become. It is time to envision and create alternatives to the hellish conditions of our society as brought into being. And to me, that was just such a powerful frame. And it really made me wonder, like, what radicalized, you know, what was your thing that radicalized you? Like, how did you get into the movement? One organizer once asked me, you know, like, what would it take to organize yourself before you got politicized? You know, what would it take? And it always makes me wonder about that moment and how people got into politics and got into questioning these systems and, you know, directly confronting these violences, and then doing that harder thing that you just talked about imagining alternatives. So if you could just talk about how you got started.
Sure thing. Well, I really came through my politics in stages, I think, of growth, like I think a lot of us do. In my 20s, I was more of an activist, and this is a distinction that Miriam and I parse out in the book a bit, but you can be an activist without really having a lot of people skills. I can be an activist here in my own home, right? I could do research work. I could create art for a campaign. There's so many ways you can be helpful, without actually having to take up the craft that is organizing, the ability to build relationships, the ability to share knowledge in a way that is liberatory and not sort of, what Freire called like the banking model, where I'm just trying to deposit my ideas into you. And I was, unsurprisingly, like a lot of people who come into their politics, I was a really bitter person. I was a really angry person. And I was very impatient with people for not defending one another, for not defending themselves. And I think that most of what I did was colored by that impatience. And I got very skills focused. I'm still a very skills focused person in some ways because I get very obsessive about being task oriented and being effective. But those things were at the top of my mind: task oriented, effectiveness. And that made me useful in some respects, but it was very limiting. And then like some different things happened I had been involved in animal rights, and, there were not great times, right, in the 2000s for people involved in animal rights. There was some ugly repression that went on. I won't get into that too much, but I took a step back from things, and I wasn't super sure I was going to do activism or protest anymore. And then a friend hit me up because there was something going on downtown, and she's like, this is gonna be a big deal and we need your help. And I was like, I don't have time for this, but it was this thing called Occupy. And I was like, maybe I'll come, I don't know. And then I saw on the internet that bankers had thrown a bunch of McDonald's applications out the windows on all these young people who were protesting. And that got me like, so angry that I just dropped what I was doing and I went downtown. And I would say that for all of its flaws, that was a super important moment for me because it was a glimpse of potential. I showed up at Jackson and LaSalle in the financial district of Chicago, and I saw people sitting in circles all over the place, talking, drumming, talking about ideas, talking about socialism, which it's really easy for people to forget now that folks weren't just walking around talking about socialism in 2010. Like you would be called a kook or a dinosaur or something for talking about socialism. But people were talking about anarchism. People were talking about, well, we hate these bankers, but do we actually want anyone to go to prison? Like these were the conversations I was hearing. And I thought, this is what's missing. I heard someone say once that Occupy wasn't the left, it formed in the void of a left in the United States. And that's very much what it felt like to me, was that I was seeing something emergent, something that had potential to create launch points. And so I pretty immediately was all in and was just like, okay, how can my skills be of use here? How can I help? And one of the ways that I saw that I could help was that the media was obsessed with us. So I could go to, the South Side and team up with the folks defending the mental health clinics, and the media would follow, because this is what Occupy is doing today. We could go to a school that parents were occupying and run barricades outside, and the media would film it. And suddenly this would get more traction in the media. And so I made a lot of great friends that way around town. I learned a lot more about local struggles and got to know people I never would have gotten to know, made some really wonderful lifelong friends. And it was in the midst of all of that work, I'm pretty sure, is when Miriam Kaba sort of got a read on what I was doing and that we lived in the same neighborhood. And I had no idea Miriam knew who the fuck I was. Like, none. But when I was at a coffee shop called Ennui that no longer exists, but it was a place a lot of activists and political types kind of hung out. Lou Rosenbaum, who's a really long time organizer in this neighborhood, waved at me and was like, hey, come over here. He's like, I want you to meet Miriam Kaba. And I was like, oh, wow, hi, really, really honored to meet you. And she just wanted me to sit down and join the conversation, which I did. And it was really through Miriam that my politics began to expand in ways that were creative, I think, and more useful to my community, because she was very patient with me, as Miriam knows how to be with people. In the beginning, when she first started asking me if I wanted to collaborate on different projects, I was always rattling off the things I wasn't going to do. I wasn't going to handhold these motherfuckers. I wasn't going to put up with any bullshit from any misogynists, all these things, always naming what I wasn't going to do. And Miriam would say, that's fine. You don't have to do that. But the longer that we were co-organizing these big events and the more sort of people were starting to see me as a leader, she was like, well, now you have to make a decision, because you don't have to do all those things if you're just doing activism. You do have to get good at those things if you're organizing, if you're going to allow people to take leadership from you. And that was hard. That was really freaking hard. And my style of communication was so blunt, like someone would mess up something that they'd done for the group, and I would just be like, oh, okay, X, Y, and Z is wrong with this. I can fix it later if you want. Just like these really unthinking sort of statements. And, more experienced folks had to be patient with me and explain to me, like, you can't respond to somebody contributing that way. Like, you have to be grateful. And actually, maybe the way you would do it isn't necessarily right or important. Like, maybe that doesn't matter. And so really learning about how to think alongside and not think I know better all the time, and really thinking deeply about what it means to not abandon other people, and to not sort of situate our politics from a place of knowing better, but wanting all of us to do better together. And, it's an ongoing process, right? I've got an ego like anyone. I've got my sensitivities, but I know I've come a long way in that more than a decade since Miriam and I had coffee at Ennui the first time. And I know that these skills are what make all of the projects that I have helped to succeed possible.
Wow. I really thank you for sharing that, and that path that, it also just brought so many moments, the mental health movement in Chicago, the occupation of the clinics, the occupation of the school, and you mentioned this moment of like seeing people find their own power. And I definitely resonate with that, like just in organizing meetings and especially when I was down at Fort Hood, organizing at the active duty base there, trying to support people to refuse deployments, to people that were going AWOL, people that were seeking mental health support instead of deploying. And also how hard it was sometimes for people to see their own power. Like you can see it, you can feel it in the space. And yet, you talked about this a little bit in your talk about how like sometimes it's easier to not see that. And I was just wondering, like, from your perspective, how does art, I mean, you've always kind of like, utilize art and culture and creative direct action. Like, how does that play a role in creating space to imagine and for people to take up that power that they really have?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind for me with that question is something my friend Shane Burley says a lot about how people need to see things to believe they can exist, and that's, I believe, true of things like mutual aid. Some people need to see it functioning to believe that, yes, this can be done. I think it's true of solidarity, like folks who think that have a really cynical opinion of people don't believe other people will ever show up for each other until they see it done. And there are some things we can't just show people, right? We can't just be like, here's your liberation. Like, be so cool if we could. But I think a lot about what do people need to see in order to fill in the blanks themselves, in order to have that imagining. I mean, I did not have any fucking clue what freedom looked like until well into my 30s. I had no concept of it. I don't know if I ever believed in it as a possibility within my own life enough to even aspire to it. I knew what I wanted to destroy. I knew what I wanted to end. And I think I had hopes that more idealistic and creative people than me would come up with whatever was supposed to happen next. But, in that sort of imaginative laziness, I was stuck. I was stuck in that place, and there was a lot of despair in that being stuck that I wasn't even conscious of, like that I didn't even realize, like, this is what you're letting drag you down, because it's easier to, just like it's easier to be angry than be sad, it's easier to be cynical than be sad, and it's easier to be dismissive. And with art, what I really learned is that it helps people envision the transformation, because we show them different types of transformation. We give people cues, snapshots. One example that comes to mind was that there was an event years ago, a reproductive justice rally in Chicago that I was co-organizing. And this was a really fraught organizing process, because I had never organized an event before where I knew we would have counter protesters and that they would be on the plaza with us. Like, we knew the police were going to do nothing to separate these people from us. And some people found that kind of scary. And I found it scary primarily because of the ambition of what we were trying to do. We wanted a family-friendly event. And it's like, how do I tell people to bring their families? And, that we're going to have this big moment and these aunties are over here and, being scary and shit. And so we came up with a game plan to sort of help people stay in the moment. And it was multi-layered. And the art was a big part of it. There were like 4 art making parties in the run up to this action, which is more than I've ever done. And the reason why was that I told my co-organizers, I don't want people to feel like we're fighting these antis for the plaza. I want them to feel like we own that plaza. That's our plaza. It's draped in our messages, our emotions, our love for each other, and that they're this kind of out of place presence, just like these losers hanging out, taking up space. And so that's what we did. It was one of the more gorgeous events I've ever co-organized, and it was just surrounded, people were surrounded by all these artistic visions and depictions and all these beautiful quotations. And it gave people a sense of, you know, Ruthie says, freedom is a place, you know, it is the place that we make. And we were placemaking together. We were creating a place in which people could imagine what we wanted and imagine it being possible, imagining us as having the power to not just transform a plaza, but transform the world. And that is the power of art. And I'll also say at that same rally, the opposition brought a marching band to try to drown us out noise-wise. And they didn't succeed, but it was frustrating for some of our people, particularly in the back. And we also had a lot of volunteers who had sort of formed a human wall, like many rows deep, to try to separate our more vulnerable folks and our families who we had in a different sort of area of the plaza. And so those folks were taking the brunt of all this noise, having volunteered to be in this difficult spot. So we wanted some, you know, we wanted to offset this. And so we had our own band. We had a brass band that looked real fucking cool and played You Don't Own Me. And when those people came bursting out from behind the Picasso, it was like another reclamation. It was another sort of moment of suddenly everyone's singing and it's like, we own this place. Your silly little band ain't shit. Ours looks way better, sounds way better. And we are full of joy. And in that way, art gave people a way of pushing back without actually having to fight these assholes. So I think that there are so many ways that we bring art to bear to empower people and to allow them to see the things we can't completely show them.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And it also makes me think about, you know, all the layers in which art creates these spaces, transforms ideas, creates meaning out of trauma. And simultaneously, I think about how this continuous kind of drumbeat of this, of the kind of co-optation of culture by capitalism, by white supremacy, by elite institutions. And, you know, I think about that a lot with a lot of the students and stuff that I'm working with. It's like rupturing those spaces and creating different visions. And, you know, that's just kind of sitting in my mind as I want to turn to this question that's, you know, kind of starting to get some of the, or dealing with some of the heart of the kind of fraughtness and complexity of this project is, you know, the veteran community is implicated in all these forms of violence. You know, I participated directly in an occupation, like I am implicated in all of that. And I also believe, you know, from what I've learned from the abolition community is that, you know, I'm not the worst thing I've done. And I want other people to know that they're not the worst things that they've done. But I also, you know, think that there's like a question of reckoning and accountability. And I just wonder, like, for you and all of your activist work, like, what does it mean to, like, what does it mean? Like, what do you think about veteran artists, and like, what do you think their role is in creating, you know, this kind of liberatory space? Like, where do they fit into this vision?
Well, when I think about the role of veterans, the first thing that comes to mind is how complicit and culpable so many of us are, right? And so much violence. As I was saying in my speech, that most of us know that at some level, our lifestyle is coming at the expense of people who are suffering horribly. And so the first thing I think a bunch of us would probably need to do would be to hop off any high horses that might be circulating. Because if you live in the United States, the rest of the world already sees you the way a lot of us might look at folks who are like, that person has perpetrated violence. It's like, they're part of a violent thing. And it's like, yep, us too. We're part of empire. And, you know, even those of us that are getting screwed over are pretty constantly trying to leverage different benefits within this system. It's what we've been handed. It's what we're trying to operate within and hopefully trying to upend, but we're part of it. And we've all played a part in someone else's suffering. We've all known that someone else was suffering so that we could get closer to power or to comfort or whatever it is we're seeking. So I want us all to start from a place of being really real about that. And then I want us to think about the ways that people get indoctrinated into violence, because that's not limited to the military either, right? And if we sort of silo our analysis of like people who do this one thing, you know, it's not helping us. It's not helping us interrogate how these systems sort of shuffle people towards decisions that wind up being very harmful to themselves and to other people. Kind of like what I was saying with the with regard to the vaccine hesitancy. You know, there was the popular thing to just laugh at people, make fun of people, call them selfish people. What did this get us? And in fact, I know that some of those people are really decent people who are just getting it wrong. And so there's that. I also think of my father, who for me was a moral center of gravity growing up. And to this day, now that he's gone, I often think about what he would say. We didn't always agree about things. We had some major differences, but he was always coming from a place of trying to do what was right. And he was always coming from a place of trying to do what was right for other people. He believed that everything positive came from a place of fellowship. And I think that we need to understand that more in our society. You know, as my dad got older, he was really involved with, because he was a person who'd been in recovery for many decades, he was really involved with helping other people get into recovery through AA or just other types of relationships and organizing. And was really known and loved to a lot of people in the area where he lived. And there's actually a bench now with his name in it outside of a treatment place. And that work was the work of someone who also went to Vietnam, you know, who did violent things. And it was someone who enlisted to go to Vietnam. My father wasn't drafted. He was indoctrinated into the notion that this was the right thing to do. And he was a Native man who was taken off our reservation in 1950 as an infant and given to white people, I suspect sold to white people, who were horrible and racist. And I feel, looking back on his life, that there was a trajectory that was very much intended, and he followed that to a certain point and then started making these little breaks along the way, sort of seeing that's actually not as true as I thought. And that's actually not okay what's happening over there that I used to think was okay. And some of this came through having children, right? Having a questioning child in his space all the time. It was like, actually, no, I don't like this, Dad. I don't think it's okay. And as y'all can imagine, I could be really difficult. Like, and you know, I think that when I look at how he in his life, as he was getting older, came around to trans rights, understanding these things better. He'd never been like a transphobic or a hateful person, but it wasn't something he was vocal about. It wasn't something he was educated about until a woman joined AA who was a trans person, and he befriended this person. And, you know, he was talking to me about it and saying, you know, I felt really bad as we got to know each other, because most of us in an AA tell a lot of stories about how we hurt people, and we wound up here because we hurt so many people. And all of her stories were about how she hurt herself because other people just sucked and weren't showing up and weren't treating her decently, weren't recognizing her humanity. And he's like, and all these little things that someone like me could have done that might have made her life a little easier, might have grounded things a little bit more so that maybe she wouldn't have felt the need to pick up a drink that night. And he's like, and that changed him. And it made him someone who would always say something if somebody said something transphobic, which I witnessed at the Thanksgiving dinner table once, which was amazing. Like, to see, you know, my brother-in-law get interrupted with, no. That's nonsense, and I'll tell you why. And I don't think we can dismiss the power of people who have made mistakes and who are flawed and who have done fucked up things. Because end of day, for one, that's all of us. But also, a lot of our truly wonderful and brilliant and gifted people have been sucked into these systems and brought to commit violence. And in some cases, after batteries of violence have been committed against them, at some point, we have to be willing to say that what matters is what we are willing to do together. What matters is the care we are willing to extend and what we are willing to learn. And I have comrades who have, served overseas, been involved in wars, who I would trust with my life. What matters to me is the intention and the goodwill and the solidarity that people are showing up with. And I think we need to get right with that across the board, because in-group, out-group thinking is destroying us. And I know sometimes there are reasons for it. I know sometimes these are valid statements we might make, right? But the extremity of it is destroying us. So I think we need to think a lot harder about how to be in relationship than about who we need to exclude, because that's the prevailing thinking right now. It's all about subsiloing ourselves to death. And that is a recipe for failure. That's what the ruling class wants.
Divide and conquer. Yeah. What you said about care, and, your father, and I have a daughter, and life-changing, and I'm learning a lot from them, and also what you said, that gesture of care, this is a little divergent, but it reminds me of when I went back to Iraq in 2009 as a witness to a labor conference during the occupation, as a civilian, as a part of Iraq Veterans Against the War. And, I, as a representative, I said I was there in your country. I pointed my weapon at your families and your communities, and for that, I'm sorry. I'm not here for forgiveness. I'm here to take responsibility. And I remember this man, yelling and screaming in the back of the auditorium and kind of rushing up to the stage. And I thought he was going to come beat me up, because I kind of thought that's what I deserved. And instead, the translation came through the earpiece, and I just want to come up on stage and give this gentleman a hug. And he hugged me. And I don't know, there's something in that makes me want to endlessly show up in the right way, on the right side, and also be accountable for the things I've been involved with. And I hope, knowing that is something I hope other veterans, I want to continually encourage other veterans through many means to do that work. But all this ties back into this, this other point that I wanted to kind of ask you about. In a 2016 article about Standing Rock, you wrote, our people are forced to accept false boundaries and containment, assimilation, because we are offered no other choice. We are pushed into spaces that are not seen as limiting expansion until those lands or waters are found to have significant value. When the prospect of wealth is dedicated, these lands are detected, these lands and waters are also looted, leaving diseases and devastation in the wake of still more violence against both land and human beings. And reading that, reviewing a bunch of your writing before this, it made me think about this violence not just being on the land and the people, but also about extracting of people and their labor for colonial interests. And from the beginning of settler colonialism, and you talked a lot about this in your opening talks, the way Native people have been enlisted into this system of colonial violence. And throughout the American Indian Wars, the US military relied on Native scouts to wayfind and guide their military campaigns against other Native Americans. continuing this in other counterinsurgency strategies in Afghanistan and Iraq. We saw the continued recruitment of Afghans and Iraqis into US-backed and directed military operations. And for many BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, POC veterans, and many veterans in general that come from communities that have been targeted by state violence, there's a keen awareness of these painful contradictions. Yet there's a little space to unpack it and confront these practices and demand a different way forward. For you, what are ways to build out that work and sustain that work of examining these contradictions in hope of new unlikely connections might be formed? In other words, like new creative spaces for solidarity. So I feel like it's like wading into all of the messiness, and you know, I also want to couch that question, the fact that I'm a white male, and I like, it's also like there's layers of me, like what is my role in even asking that kind of question, and also being a part of all that. So I don't know, like at the same time, I just believe so profoundly in the opportunity of solidarity through looking at that, like by untangling some of that there's space for connections that maybe we haven't had before. And I guess I just want to ask for you, like, what does it look to build that work out for you and your work? And what does it look like to sustain it? Because that's even harder.
Well, I think that there are layers, right? There are a number of ways I think that we address this, but to build out sort of unlikely solidarities or more difficult solidarities, I personally think that mutual aid is one of the most important sort of launch pads, right? Because people learn from each other in shared struggle. Like my father and his friend who was a trans woman, it's like what brought them into relationship and understanding? It was shared struggle. He was committed to her struggle to remain sober because other people had been committed to his struggle to remain sober. And so when we think about what are the concerns that we can easily get to the table on, you know, and maybe that's the fact that there's a food crisis in the community, and maybe that's that we need climate preparedness in our communities. This was actually my plan for 2020 before the pandemic struck. I was going to be working with some folks to start building out climate response teams here in Chicago. I hope it's something we can still get off the ground eventually, where we would have, you know, block teams and different groups who would be trained to take certain steps in the immediate aftermath of certain disasters, and to, you know who to check in on, how to turn off, you know, different utilities that might need to be shut down. And that there would be a lot of people who might be interested in that, particularly in the wake of different disasters that we knew were coming, who might not show up for a different kind of meeting. But that once we get into relationship with people, you know, opportunities pop up. And here in my neighborhood, Edgewater Mutual Aid actually did see some evolution of that kind, where folks were focusing on things like prescriptions and, you know, grocery runs, but a member of the network disclosed to somebody in his pod that he was the victim of racism at the hands of his building management, and that this was causing him a lot of stress. And so the person was like, oh, well, how could we support you? And this conversation evolved into pulling a bunch of people who'd never protested before into organizing a protest outside of this man's building to kind of put management on notice. Like, people are watching. A whole lot of noisy, loud, highly political people who know how to like get the press's attention are watching. So this needs to stop. And I think that these kinds of things, I mean, it's not entirely organic, right? Because we are bringing our politics to the mix in intentional ways, and we are building relationships in very intentional ways if we're doing our work right. But there is something much more natural and much more possible, I think, when we're working from a place of shared concern, rather than simply trying to intervene and make someone just understand that their politics are bad. I know people want it to work that way. I don't think anything works that way. And so, yeah, I think it lies in shared struggle. It lies in getting people to the table for what we can get them to the table to, and building the conversation out from there. You're still muted.
And that I thank you. And that idea of shared struggle and care, I just have one question. My last question is, in a 2018 article, you talked about Tiffany Rusher, and who was on crisis watch, which meant being stripped of all clothing and belongings and placed in a bare cell with only a suicide with lights on 24 hours a day. And this resulted in torture and ended up resulting in their life. And recently at Stateville, I was talking to some of the students there, and they were talking about how that kind of crisis watch continues today, where individuals are told that they're, because they're concerned about their mental health, they're going to be put onto this form of crisis watch where they're stripped naked and placed on a 24-hour watch and continually woken up. And that form of violence through the state as a form of care, that's what it says it's doing. And I guess I just wanted to acknowledge that and think about the fact that you've done so much work around abolition and envisioning alternative to these logics of violence that just are so dominant, that this is like literally the people involved in that believe they're providing care. And what does it mean to unpack that? And you, in that same article, you lift up an essay on the university and the undercommons, written by scholar Fred Moten and Stephen Harney, that talks about abolition as an important framework. You quote the essay: "What is, so to speak, the object of abolition? Not so much the abolition of prisons, but the abolition of a society that could have prisons, that could have slavery, that could have the wage, and therefore not abolition as an elimination of anything, but abolition as the founding of a new society. When we look past this sensationalism of major headlines and examine the actual dynamics of mass incarceration, it becomes increasingly impossible to justify this perspective. While some offer calls for reform, such calls ignore the reality that an institution grounded in the commodification of human beings through torture and the deprivation of their liberty cannot be made good." And with that in mind, I just was hoping that you would talk a little bit how abolition can be this framework that can help us unpack all of these logics of violence, from colonialism, militarism, empire, etc.
Well, thank you for that. That particular essay meant a lot to me. I used to work at Uptown People's Law Center, and UPLC defended Tiffany, represented her interests, fought for her, tried to save her. And as we know, she was lost because of the violence of sort of that care, right, that she was being provided out of concern for her suicidality, that just flung her into an irretrievable place of despair and psychosis. But how does abolition give us the framework that we need to move forward? I think we need to start from a place of understanding that the prison system, whether we know it or not, whether people realize it or not, is ground zero for so many of the things that we're afraid of. I'm constantly talking to my anti-fascist friends about, like, to me, there's no anti-fascism without prison abolition. It's the heart of what anything fascism could become in this country. We don't need to build a system of concentration camps to dispose of human beings. We already have these horrible facilities where we send people, and the most of the population stops giving a fuck about what happens to them. And when stories get out about unspeakable conditions and horrible abuses, people either just ignore it often, or say things like, well, it's bad, but people wind up in prison for a reason. This system that manufactures premature death, the Nazis don't have to make it once if they fully get their full authoritarian situation. They don't have to invent it. It exists. It's there. It is the beast that they would feed us to. And so I think that all understanding of abolition in this particular moment, when we're faced with this threat of global fascism, has to begin there, right? Understanding what this really is. We are talking about a means of controlling and disposing of human beings en masse, right? When we become problematic or superfluous to the relations of capitalism. And it's a way of cutting losses, and that's only going to get more dramatic, right? And in this point, we are seeing, there's less of a focus on let's pack more and more people into these facilities, and more of a focus on how do we sprawl these workings, these carceral workings, into people's everyday lives? How do we monitor and control people and penalize people through, surveillance, through workplace restrictions, through restrictions on where you can live, through all these forms of social control that are carceral. Carcerality is the authoritarianism that we are up against. It will continue to expand, like I talked about with AI. The carceral state is a monstrous thing that, just like militarism, is only going to morph in more horrifying ways, as we get further into this apocalyptic moment. But that aside for a moment, abolition is utterly essential in that it asks us to imagine how we could live otherwise. And that was not a question I even knew how to ask in an honest way. Before I became friends with Miriam, I knew not this, but I didn't know what was, what should be. And abolition beckons us to interrogate what's possible and to try to resolve the contradictions, right, inherent in the world we want. Like, I don't want police, right? I do want people to feel like they have recourse when something violent occurs. What does this demand? What must we build? I don't want people to have to deal with medical surveillance. But all of that is so hardwired into people's sense of responsibility and how these systems function. How else might that look? The book Healing Justice Lineages is an essential resource for anyone who's interested in that conversation. And those folks talk a bit about sort of some of the work we need to do in terms of making folks who are clinicians and practitioners into abolitionist healing justice practitioners. Like, what are the skills that we need to take care of each other, to honor each other, to protect each other in the absence of these violent apparatuses that don't actually even do those things or do them well anyway, right? And part of it is getting over the illusion. Like I said when I was giving my little talk, that we love our illusions. We cling to our illusions. I remember once giving a bunch of statistics on Twitter about why the police are just bullshit and they don't help. And somebody replied, like, I hear what you're saying, but I want to have someone to call if I get robbed. I thought, someone to call? Like, they're like, hi, I got robbed. And like, and what do they do? Like, they write it down? Like, what then happens? But people need that sense that there's an order to things. There's something to do. There's something that I do when this happens, and maybe some resolution comes, but I did my part. I did the reporting part. And to get people to really examine what they're not getting, what they're being cheated out of with these illusions, like that illusion that it matters, that like my car burned a couple of months ago under interesting circumstances. And, the police had nothing useful to say about it. And if I had just lingered on this idea that these people are the solution, that would have been a really devastating day. But, I had no expectation that those people were going to help me. I consulted with my friends about, okay, what am I going to do? Because for one thing, I need a car because I have medical needs. I need to be able to get to physical therapy. We need a new transportation plan. My community actually provides that plan with me. It's like, okay, I need to re-examine my safety plan. What's going on with me? Are there known threats? Do we need to make any changes? My community provides that to me. In actually building relationships with people and learning how to build safety plans and learning self-defense and all these things that we can do together, we actually empower ourselves to do the things that we'd like to believe that the system fulfills in some way, but we know that it doesn't. And, I'm not saying like we can replace all institutions with, goodwill. Like if I need surgery, I need a trained surgeon. We need institutions of some kind, but we need transformed institutions in the ways that we need things to still exist. And we need to recognize that a lot of this shit does not need to fucking exist. It was not always there. Like, things like, people talk about how ICE hasn't actually existed that long. Police have not actually existed that long. Like in the scheme of human history, people chalk up police to slave patrols a lot, and that's a very real root, right? But we can track the different routes of how policing has evolved in the United States, right? To things like labor unions, to things like more immigrant folks entering a community and not subscribing to all the social norms. We can track everything policing is to people that the system was trying to crush, control, invisibilize, etc. As I had said before in the piece, you can't make it good. And so starting there with who this actually serves, what it's actually for, and then what are our actual hopes and dreams and needs and heart's desires, And if we can start there with each other, there are a whole lot of people who think I'm absolutely batty when it comes to this prison abolition thing. But when I start asking them, like, what is your heart's desire? What do you want for your community? It's a bunch of the same shit I want. I just believe that if we build those things out well enough, if we really had a world where we were cared for, if we really had a world where folks had healthcare and housing, people would start to realize that they don't need this shit. And that's not what any of these systems are there to ensure or provide. And that's another reason that they don't want us to have these things, because they want to keep us precarious and afraid of each other and struggling. And the more we struggle, the more we think that maybe we need someone to call. We need a panic button. I want to move us away from the panic button and towards a place of creativity, where instead of this panic button that I keep hitting and nothing happens, I'm making a safety plan with my friends. I am figuring out how we mobilize in a disaster in my neighborhood. These things are going to help us survive everything that's ahead, all the skills that we're building now, and building the habit and the understanding and the belief that we are all precious. That is what is going to keep us alive, not any of this shit. And I think that once people really connect with that this is not life sustaining, this is not life preserving, this is not safety, and we have the potential to make that stuff, I think we're going to gain a lot of ground. I think we're going to do things that people aren't allowing themselves to believe are possible right now. We just need to get more folks to that place of creativity with us and, into relationship. And the more of us that we get into right relationship and we get into those modes of creativity, the closer we're going to be to getting free.
Getting free. I love that way as a closing. Thank you so much. Ronik, you want to take it out?
Close it out home. Thank you for bringing the fire, Kelly. Just as expected, just as hoped for. I speak on behalf of everybody who's still in this Zoom, and you're getting all the love reactions, I hope, on your screen, that we're so grateful for your fire, for your urgency, for your complex grammar around survival and shared struggle and reciprocal care. Everyone go out and buy Kelly and Miriam Kava's brand new book, pre-order it now on Haymarket Press. Your organizing, your writing feels like a life raft amidst these disastrous times. So we're very grateful for your presence. Aaron, as always, much love to you. Thank you so much. it is over 5 and we're running out of time here, and we got to end things with our cart and everybody else here. I know that we're sending our love. We didn't get a chance to address some of these questions in the chat, but I just got to hold up that Monica Cosby is in the audience here in our Zoominar and says that she was dear friends and roommates in the inside with Tiffany Rusher. And so we want to send love to Monica and everyone else who's joined us. Thank you so much for being here for our 6th talk in the seminar series. 2 weeks from today, the last talk by Tiffany King, not to be missed, April 13th. Please stay tuned for that. If you want to share this recording with the folks in your world, your comrades, your loved ones, all of the recordings from our seminar series will be on our website, survivingthelongwars.online/scholarly series. So stay tuned for that. Make sure that you follow everything that's happening with Surviving the Long Wars. Our exhibitions are on display, the Chicago Cultural Center, the Hyde Park Art Center, and the Newberry Library, all spring long. Please tell your friends, tell your comrades, come check out this beautiful, brilliant artwork that's on display. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Kelly. I hope that we did good work here.
Thank you so much, Kelly.
Thank you all for having me.
Thank you, everyone. Be well. Take good care.